Before history remembered him as Peter, the Rock, he was simply Simon, a fisherman in Capernaum, known more by the strength of his hands than by the shape of his faith. His world was measured in tides, in weathered ropes, in the creak of wood before dawn, and in the familiar rhythm of casting and pulling nets beside the Sea of Galilee. This was not the life of kings or scholars, but it was honest, demanding, and deeply rooted, a life inherited as much as chosen. In that harbor, among gull cries and market voices, Simon learned how to read the water, how to endure long nights, and how to laugh at disappointment before trying again. He was sharp-tongued, quick to speak, and full of the stubborn energy that makes a man seem larger than the boat he stands in. Beside him was Andrew, his brother, quieter in manner yet no less steady, the sort of companion who did not need many words to be understood. Together they lived inside a pattern older than memory, working, mending, bargaining, and bringing home whatever the sea allowed. Yet even in that ordinary life, there was a restlessness in Simon, as if the horizon was always asking him a question he could not quite answer. Capernaum was tranquil only from a distance, because up close it was full of motion, with traders unloading baskets, mothers calling children home, and fishermen inspecting torn mesh under the hard light of morning. Simon belonged to that bustle completely, and there was comfort in belonging, in knowing where to stand, what to do, and what tomorrow would probably require. Fishing was uncertain work, but it was at least a familiar uncertainty, the kind a person learns to survive without surrendering his dignity. Every coin mattered, every catch carried the weight of household needs, and every failed night followed him back to shore like an accusation. He was not merely choosing between jobs or adventures, he was helping sustain a family, preserve a trade, and uphold a life built by generations before him. That is what makes Simon's story so human. When change approached him, it did not come to a man with nothing to lose, but to a man whose roots were deep. Andrew had already begun listening to whispers of something greater, to the growing talk of a teacher whose words stirred hearts in ways nets never could. Simon may have heard those rumors with a smirk, the way practical men often greet holy possibility, but even skepticism can hide a private hunger. Then came one of those mornings that must have felt painfully ordinary at first, the kind after a long night of labor ending with little to show for it. Tired fishermen know a special kind of silence, and Simon carried it as he brought his boat in, weary from effort, irritation, and the dull embarrassment of emptiness. Nets still needed cleaning whether they had been fruitful or not, because responsibility does not disappear when hope does. Into that worn-out moment stepped Jesus, not arriving with military thunder or royal spectacle, but with the unsettling calm of someone entirely at home in another man's disappointment. He asked to use Simon's boat, pushing just offshore so the gathered crowd could hear him teach, and Simon agreed, perhaps out of courtesy, perhaps curiosity, perhaps because exhaustion sometimes lowers the walls we usually keep up. From the boat, Simon listened as Jesus spoke to people standing at the edge of the water, and though we are not told every word from that hour, we can imagine how strange it felt to hear truth spoken with the same natural authority the sea itself seemed to carry. When the teaching ended, Jesus turned to the fishermen and said what no tired professional wants to hear after a fruitless night: "Go back out, lower the nets again." Simon answered with the honesty of a man too exhausted for performance, reminding him that they had worked all night and caught nothing, yet adding the sentence that changed his life: "Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." What followed was more than a miracle of abundance. It was a collision between Simon's experience and a reality larger than experience could explain. The nets filled so heavily they began to break, fish thrashing in such numbers that partners had to rush over with another boat, and even then both vessels strained under the impossible catch. In one instant, the sea Simon thought he understood became a witness against his certainty, and the ordinary water of his working life turned into holy ground. His first reaction was not celebration but collapse, because true revelation often arrives not as excitement but as exposure. Simon fell before Jesus and said, in essence, "Leave me, Lord, for I am a sinful man," because when greatness comes near, we suddenly see ourselves with terrible clarity. Jesus did not step back from that confession, he answered it with a calling, telling Simon not to be afraid, for from now on he would catch people. That invitation was as astonishing as the catch itself, because it did not merely promise blessing, it demanded transformation. Simon was being asked to move from securing fish to serving souls, from mastering a trade to surrendering control, from life as he had always known it into a future he could not map. It is easy to romanticize that moment because we know what came after, but on the shore it must have felt costly, immediate, and frighteningly real. Boats still had to be tied, nets still smelled of work, family still waited, and the miracle itself may have sharpened the temptation to stay, because success makes familiar life harder to leave. If the catch had been poor, perhaps walking away would have looked like escape, but abundance made departure look almost irrational. Simon was not choosing between failure and possibility, he was choosing between visible provision and invisible promise. That is why this turning point reaches across centuries into our own lives, because most of us do not stand at the edge of one dramatic decision so much as at the edge of a costly trust. We cling to what we can count, touch, ensure, and explain, even when something in us senses that comfort is not the same as calling. Simon's greatness did not begin when he became fearless, it began when he stepped forward while fear still had a voice. He left not because he had every answer, but because one encounter with Jesus had made the old answers too small. From that harbor, the long arc of Simon's life began to bend toward a destiny he could never have imagined while sorting wet rope in the morning sun. He would still speak too quickly, still misunderstand, still lurch between boldness and fragility, but this first surrender revealed the seed of the man he would become. Faith did not erase his rough edges overnight, it redirected them, taking the very intensity that once served survival and shaping it for witness, courage, and love. This is what makes his story such a powerful foundation for a journey from denial to legacy. The man who would one day falter publicly first learned to follow privately, in the costly silence after a simple command. The shore of Capernaum reminds us that discipleship often begins where our routine has worn grooves into our souls, and where Jesus meets us not after we have become extraordinary, but while we are still ordinary enough to think the day belongs to us. Simon left everything, yet in losing the life he could control, he began to receive the life only God could give. The fisherman did not yet know all that following would demand, but he knew enough to rise, enough to trust, and enough to walk behind the one who had called his name. If Simon's first step has stirred something in you, let that question linger. What net are you still gripping because it feels safer than obedience? Share this video with someone who needs the courage to choose faith over familiarity, and let this story begin a conversation far beyond this channel. Be sure to like the video, subscribe, and join us for the next episode as we continue tracing Peter's remarkable path from doubt to surrender to a legacy that still speaks today.